Drones, a lot of hikers have them, and in this video we're going to be covering responsibly flying a drone while hiking. I'm also going to touch on what drone I use and why. Over the years I've been having a lot of questions about drones and flying, and you can go on the internet and find all kinds of videos on reviews and specs and all of that fun stuff. But what I wanted to touch on the video today is kind of an intangible of flying when hiking. So in this video, we're going to touch on guidelines here in the United States, things that are across the board that you're always going to have to follow, some of the gray areas if you do want to fly internationally, some things to keep in mind. Along the way, I'll also be talking about some things that maybe aren't necessarily laws, but are things that you should always follow just so that you're responsibly flying a drone while hiking. Before we get into any of this, if you're new to my channel, welcome. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit the subscribe or like button. Really helps with the algorithm and helps me grow. Based in Colorado, so for perspective of this video, some of this will be kind of relevant to that. The topic of flying drones in general is something that is pretty divisive, whether you're a hiker or not. People just have seemingly strong feelings on them, so I'm not going to dive into a lot of that per se, but I do want to have that kind of being an undertone of the conversation so that you're responsibly flying. But at the end of the day, if you don't like drones and don't like flying, that's totally your opinion. They are legal to fly in a lot of areas while hiking. So let's first dive into why you'd want to fly a drone while you hike. Well, for people like me, content creators, it's a great way to add perspective to the hike, the trip. There's many cases where search and rescue will use drones to help find a missing person or missing people. They're a great way to survey areas, whether you work on in an official role or just trying to do some data on an area you're going to be hiking. Especially useful if you're trying to scout out perhaps avalanche conditions or terrain features that are hard to see from far away. And finally, they just give you a great perspective of the hike. There's cool angles of mountains you can get with video and photos, and certainly just adds a different layer of depth and kind of scope to the hike that you're doing. Anyone can really go out and buy a drone, a hobbyist or recreationalist. I always recommend, before we even jump into talking about laws and regulations, understand how to fly the thing. Make sure that you know the capabilities of it, how to responsibly take it off and land, and then of course control it while it's in the air. So all of these go without saying, but really important to get some practice in. There's courses and tutorials you can find online for your specific drone. Before you start flying anywhere, you need to register your drone, at least here in the United States, with the FAA. And that is like a $15 a year-ish fee. Once you're registered, you do also technically have to display the registration number on the drone. So that can be through a sticker, write it on, etc. But it should be publicly displayed as well. When you're flying a drone and hiking with it, it's important to do the same level of research that you would for something like researching the weather, understanding the trail route, the mountain conditions. That's all really important to do when you're flying a drone as well. But I will say that it is increasingly difficult to get consistent information all in one place. And so we're going to start with areas on the federal level that you just can never fly at all. Some of these are not relevant to hiking, but they need to be mentioned. So stadiums, airports, sporting events, Washington, D.C. as a whole. There's restricted airspace. There's several apps and different resources. I'll link some of them below that you can check out. But basically you can, pull up a map of where you're going, see if there's restricted airspace on just a general level, and then you can dive into the hiking side of it later. Another general rule is to ensure that you always have visible eyesight on the drone. This can be sometimes pretty tricky to do if you're flying, above the trees, things like that. But that is something that is important so that, if it does crash or God forbid, hit something, you understand where it is. Another general rule is that you need to be flying no higher than 400 feet. That's not total elevation, that's just the distance once you have actually taken it off from wherever you are. And then finally, avoid flying around crowds. In the hiking world, this can apply to things like campgrounds, visitor centers, busy trails, mountaintops with a lot of people, things like that. I think a lot of that comes into just a respect and kind of social side of it, but also if it does happen to fall out of the sky or crash, you're not hurting anyone. Now we'll dive into some things that are on a federal level that are very specific to hiking. So National parks, wilderness areas, you cannot fly in either one of them. National parks, super easy to figure out if you're in one or not. They make it pretty abundantly clear. Most of them do, with signs all over the place, but you shouldn't even need to read the sign because you should just know I'm in a national park, I cannot fly here. With national parks, I believe the verbiage is something like you're not allowed to take off or land within one. So sometimes you'll see people who are flying on the outside of one and then flying into it. I don't like to really do things like that. That's, to me, not really super responsible. Finally, wilderness areas, same thing. You're not allowed to take off or land within one. Wilderness areas are a little tricky. So I use a website called ArcGIS. I'll link it in the description below. But basically, it'll show you a map of where you're going. You can type in a specific location, whether that be address or mountain or town in general, and you can figure out where the wilderness area boundary is. One thing that doesn't cover all the time would be wilderness study areas. Wilderness study areas, off the top of my head, there's one in Colorado and down in the San Juan Mountains. That's around a popular group of 14ers, the Handy's Peak Wilderness Study Area. So this one's not on that map, and until I was at the trailhead and realized what it was, didn't know beforehand. So even when you're doing your research, whether you're starting with things that it's always just important to do as much as you can. I always check trailheads. As we get into state and local restrictions, you'll kind of understand why, because sometimes information isn't on a website, but it'll be posted at the trailhead or vice versa. State and locally flying. Here in Colorado, we have our state parks. You're not allowed to fly in any of them. They make that abundantly clear, both on the website and then also in the visitor centers, trailheads, things like that. But if you go to our neighbor next door, Utah, most state parks you can't fly, but we recently visited one, Kodachrome National Park, where you could. You had to fill out a couple pieces of paperwork and provide your registration number, etc., but I was able to fly there. So it's always important. I usually just ask, especially I'm going to something like a state park, if I'm not sure. The park rangers will obviously be able to give you the most up-to-date information. If you're going to like an open space or a park, it's great to just read the trailhead. If there's a brochure at the trailhead, always kind of check those out as well. Just do as much research as you can. When we talk about flying drones while hiking, I think the thing that is like a common thread here is it's pretty confusing. Local levels are going to depend, obviously. So in an area like Colorado Springs, as an example, they have really like a citywide mandate on not flying unless you have some kind of special permission from them. Typically, this has not been something I've kind of found. If you're flying somewhere that's like a public space or in a city or a town, it's always important just to kind of start there and figure it out. Yeah, it can be tricky. I'm not gonna lie, it can be definitely tricky. So what I always do before I fly anywhere is just do as much research as I can. And if I go into a situation and someone, I'm encountering someone like a public official or park ranger or whomever who tells me that I can't fly there, you just apologize and perhaps ask where you could find the information so for next time. But also I tend to play things pretty conservative, and if it's an area where I don't think I can fly, like sometimes they'll mention no motorized vehicles, but they don't mention drones specifically, I'll typically won't fly there. It's just the responsible thing for me personally. Next, we get into flying internationally. So this is another tricky area. It's going to vary, obviously, country to country. Some have great information and a very clear process. Others, you can't find anything. Some countries, there's weight restrictions. So there's drone manufacturers out there who make drones under 250 grams. And that's because in some countries, you're not allowed to fly something that weighs more than that. So that's kind of a big deal in the drone world itself. We just visited Italy recently, and they had a process, but it was still pretty confusing. So there is a process for European residents versus non. I did my best to fill out everything properly, but it was pretty confusing. I'm sure there'll be language barriers involved in some cases as well. When you fly in the United States and you're flying somewhere you cannot fly, usually there'll be a fine involved if you're caught. But as you travel internationally, especially depending on where you are, consequences could be much higher than that, especially because you're not a citizen. So again, I tend to be pretty conservative, but just do as much research as you can beforehand and kind of follow the same steps I outlined for United States. So start on federal level, go to if there's a national park or a wilderness or whatever kind of place you're flying, just try to start there and do as much research. And then you can always ask when you arrive at the destination to see if you're able to fly or not. Like I said earlier in the video, flying is great. It's one of my favorite things to do, but I do get a ton of anxiety. I think the one area we talked about all the official rules and federal guidelines and things like that, but also just kind of use common sense. So, you know, if you're flying the drone super early in the morning or super late in the evening and you know there's people around you, don't expect them to be super happy about it. Especially when you're hiking, it's so hard to figure out you know, where people are around you if you're, you know, let's say doing a through hike or something like that. But again, that kind of goes into the unspoken rules and responsible aspects of, would you want someone, you know, flying around over near your campsite at that early or late hour? Probably not. The other thing I have seen before, and it drives me absolutely nuts, is flying near any kind of animal. I just think it's extremely irresponsible to do that. These animals have no idea what this is. The wilderness area is one of the reasons you're not allowed to fly there is to kind of protect the wildlife in the area. I tried to do, and this goes back to a legality perspective, but the word crowds is pretty vague. So when I'm flying on 14ers here in Colorado, 14,000 plus feet, mountains are typically pretty popular, and I don't love flying around other people on that. So obviously, you know, it's pretty tricky to have an entire mountain to yourself, but you know, if I get to a summit as an example and there's a group of 5, 6, 7 plus people, I usually won't fly. If there's a couple, I'll usually ask. That's something I kind of like to do on a responsible level, would be, you know, just have the conversation with someone like, hey, I'm going to fly my drone just for a couple minutes here. Like, do you mind? And if you're in a legal area, I think it's kind of the right thing to do. Some people have not taken that well, but if I'm asking and, you know, they are clearly not into it, then okay, at least I know, and then I can make the decision from there. Like, do I really want to piss these people off, or do I want to wait for them to move on and then fly? But at least if you ask someone, you kind of can check the temperature of the situation first. Now, let's talk about the drone that I use. So this is the DJI Mavic Air. This is quite an old drone for those of you who are into the drone world. I've had this now for about 3-4 years at this point, flown it in all different kinds of conditions, different countries, many different states, and this thing is a beast. What I like the most about this, and this is not a review by any mention, but I just want to touch on this quickly. The reason that I stick with this, and I'll probably be upgrading pretty soon, is that this is a pretty heavy drone. So here in Colorado, a lot of the hiking that I do is quite high in elevation. And from a basic kind of general science perspective, the drone needs to have some weight to it so that it can continue to climb up in elevation. I spend a lot of time in the 12,000 foot plus range, especially while hiking. I've flown it above 14,000 feet several times and it does well. A lot of the newer drones are quite a bit lighter, which obviously from a, you know, carrying it around perspective is awesome, but I haven't found that from a spec perspective that any of these drones can really fly up to the altitude that I require. So that's why I've stuck to this thing for a while. You know, it's crashed several times. I've lost it on several occasions, and it's, yeah, just holding up really great. That's gonna wrap up my video on how to responsibly fly a drone while hiking. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If there's an area that I missed, you know, perhaps a legal perspective, a social perspective, let me know. In general, I'll just wrap up the video with this. When you're flying a drone while hiking, there are really kind of two things to consider. Obviously the legality of it, and then the social side of it as well. The legal side is very cut and dry, where the social side is kind of depend on the individual. The more that we can be socially responsible flying these things, the more we'll be able to. If people continue to buy drones and break the laws, that's the quickest way to get them banned in more areas, but also just piss people off. That's another way to really sour the public opinion of them and not be able to use them, which would really be a shame because, like I said, outside of personal use, there's just so many different ways that drones can really be beneficial in the outdoors. Hope you found this video helpful. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you're new to my channel, I do hike guides here in Colorado, tips, information, so much more. So check out some other videos while you're on the channel. I also have a website, thevirtualsherpa.com, which I'll link in the description below, the article that basically summarizes this video, but it will have a lot of different resources for you to check out so that you can be prepared before you have your first flight while you're hiking. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys on the next adventure.